Welcome to another deep dive. This time, we're taking a look at the world of horror movie marketing.
Oh yeah, those posters and trailers.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's fascinating, like how they manage to tap into our deepest fears. And, well, make us want to watch, even though we know we'll be scared.
Yeah.
So, for this deep dive, you've given me a media studies exam,
Uh-huh.
and it focuses on the marketing of two horror films, Drag Me to Hell
Wow.
and Don't Knock Twice.
Interesting choices.
By analyzing these, we're going to uncover how these films use those clever techniques to intrigue us, but also terrify us.
Well, it's all about understanding what makes horror tick, right?
Yeah.
And your exam actually starts with a quote from John Carpenter,
Oh, okay.
a master of horror.
Yeah.
He said, "Horror is a universal language.
Mm.
We're all afraid of things. Death, disfigurement, loss of a loved one. Everybody feels fear and suspense."
Mm-hmm.
So I think this idea of shared human anxieties, it kind of sets the stage for our exploration.
Yeah. Yeah. That makes sense. I mean, we all get creeped out by different things, but at the core, it's about those universal fears, right? Like, that's what connects us all.
Exactly.
Now, the exam also lays out 10, like, classic horror conventions.
Oh, yeah.
Kind of like the building blocks of the genre.
Exactly.
Things like jump scares, creepy children, or those isolated locations where you just know something bad is going to happen.
That's like a checklist.
Yeah. So understanding these conventions will help us see how they're deliberately used in marketing to evoke specific reactions from us.
Hmm.
Okay, so let's apply this to Drag Me to Hell. The poster is so striking. It's a terrified woman being pulled down by these demonic hands, like against this fiery background.
Yeah.
And the tagline, Christine Brown has a good job, a great boyfriend, and a bright future, but in 3 days, she's going to hell.
Ooh, it's a good one, yeah. It immediately creates that sense of urgency.
Yeah.
And it makes you wonder, like, how did she end up in this terrifying situation?
Yeah, it's like a glimpse into her nightmare. And we're immediately hooked, wanting to find out how she got there.
Right, right. And notice the visual elements.
Okay.
The dark color palette. It's dominated by, like, blacks and reds.
Mhm.
And it just instantly creates that feeling of dread.
Yeah.
But it's the distressed typography in the title that I find particularly clever.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's not just a font choice. It adds to that unsettling feeling, doesn't it?
Yeah.
How so?
Well, think about it. Like, the uneven lettering.
Yeah.
The jagged lettering.
Yeah.
It kind of suggests a loss of control,
Okay.
like mirroring Christine's impending descent into this chaotic and terrifying situation.
Hmm.
So it's those subtle cues that often work on a subconscious level,
Wow.
creating that unease that draws you in.
So they're not just showing us a scary image. They're using these visual techniques to evoke, like, a specific emotional response from us.
Precisely. Now, the exam also mentions the camera angle that's used in the poster.
Mm-hmm.
It's a mid-shot. It's a slight low-angle perspective.
Hmm.
So the subtle choice actually positions the viewer below Christine,
Mm-hmm.
makes us feel more vulnerable, and kind of increases our empathy for her.
I hadn't even noticed that. But yeah, it makes sense. If we feel like we're looking up at her, we're more likely to feel that fear and desperation. Right?
Exactly. And that vulnerability is key to drawing us into the story. Now, let's move on to the trailer,
Okay.
which the exam says leans heavily on close-ups of Christine's face.
Yes. And you see her fear, like, escalating throughout the trailer. And it
Mhm.
makes you wonder, like, what has she seen or experienced to cause her so much terror?
Right. And what's really interesting is how the trailer juxtaposes these close-ups
Yeah.
with, like, quick cuts to mundane settings, like her office, her apartment.
Mm-hmm.
But then you see glimpses of these dark, shadowy spaces.
It's like the supernatural is slowly invading her everyday life, which is always a terrifying thought. There are also quick cuts to supernatural occurrences,
Yeah.
like flashes of demonic faces, a hand reaching out from under the bed. It's classic horror.
It is, but it works.
It does. It gives you just enough to pique your curiosity
Mm-hmm.
without revealing too much, which is good.
And remember how they delay revealing the title?
Oh, yeah, yeah.
That classic suspense-building technique.
Keeps you on the edge of your seat waiting for that big reveal.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's shift gears to Don't Knock Twice. Now, the poster is starkly different.
Yeah.
It's just a skeletal hand emerging from darkness about to knock on a door.
Spooky.
And then the tagline, once to wake her from her bed, twice to raise her from the dead. So it immediately connects the image to a specific action and consequence,
Mm-hmm.
hinting at a story rooted in folklore, maybe an urban legend.
Right.
It's creepy, but it makes you curious about the legend. Like, what's the story behind this knock? Why is it so dangerous?
Right. And notice how both posters, though very different, use a dark color palette
Hmm.
and limited lighting. Common horror convention.
Yeah.
Creates a sense of mystery and danger.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. It's like they're saying, like, step into the darkness if you dare.
Exactly.
Okay, so what about the Don't Knock Twice trailer? What stood out to you?
Well, the trailer continues the trend of using close-ups, but this time it's not just on the protagonist, Jess.
Okay.
But we also see close-ups of other characters. They have these terrified expressions, which kind of amplifies that feeling of widespread fear.
Yeah, you're right. And they use a lot of quick cuts, jumping between those close-ups and glimpses of shadowy figures and creepy locations, like the abandoned house.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
It definitely makes you wonder what's lurking in those shadows.
Yeah.
And remember that shot of the witch's hand reaching out?
Oh, yeah.
It's strategically placed to kind of maximize that scare factor.
So they're like playing with those jump scare moments, but they're also making sure to build this chilling atmosphere through the use of sound and imagery. So they're hitting those classic horror conventions we discussed, but also using them in kind of unique ways to create this specific mood and tone. It's like,
Right.
yes, this is a horror movie, but it's also something different, something you haven't seen before.
Precisely. And this brings us to Steve Neal's theory about genre, which suggests that genres are characterized by both repetition and variation.
Mm-hmm.
So both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice, they utilize those familiar horror tropes, but they also offer something new, something that sets them apart.
So they're repeating familiar elements to signal to the audience, hey, this is a horror movie, but they're also twisting those elements
Exact.
to keep us guessing
Mhm.
and offer something fresh.
That's how they hook us, by promising both the familiar thrills we crave and the unexpected twists that keep us on the edge of our seats.
Okay, now the exam also mentions Carol J. Clover's Final Girl theory,
Oh, yeah, interesting.
which describes a resilient female protagonist
Right.
who confronts and survives the horror. It seems like both films kind of play with this idea in their marketing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the Drag Me to Hell poster, we see Christine's vulnerability, but we also see her defiance in her eyes. Like,
Yeah.
she's not just a victim, she's fighting back.
Right.
And then the Don't Knock Twice trailer shows Jess, like, fiercely protecting her daughter.
Mm-hmm.
Both are classic examples of the final girl trope.
Okay. But what's interesting to me is how Don't Knock Twice seems to subvert the typical final girl storyline, right?
Yeah.
It's not just about Jess's survival. It's about her protecting her daughter. It adds another layer to the story. It's exploring that fierce maternal instinct, right?
Absolutely.
That drives her to confront the evil threatening her family.
Yeah, it's not just about, like, one person's survival. It's about protecting those you love.
Right.
That's a great observation. It shows how these films are building on those familiar tropes, but adding their own unique spin.
Mm.
It's not just about repeating what works. It's about innovating and finding new ways to engage the audience.
Now, let's dive into audience theory and
Okay.
how it relates to these marketing material. So the exam mentions uses and gratifications theory,
Okay.
which suggests that people choose media that provides them with specific emotional experiences, the ones they seek.
Yeah.
So in this case, horror fans are actively seeking out those feelings of fear and suspense, right?
Of course.
So the marketing for these films plays directly into that desire, like promising a good scare, right?
Exactly.
By showcasing terrifying images, those chilling taglines, and like unsettling sound effects. So they're not just trying to attract anyone, right? They're targeting a specific audience that craves those intense emotional experiences. And techniques like the low-angle perspective and the Drag Me to Hell poster, which makes the viewer feel vulnerable, kind of further enhance that experience by making the fear feel more immediate and personal.
Right. It's about creating a visceral reaction, like pulling you into the story, making you feel like you're right there in the middle of a horror.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Now, something that really stands out to me about Don't Knock Twice is its use of religious imagery.
Oh, yeah.
The trailer shows like glimpses of religious icons like the Virgin Mary,
Right.
and there's a definite sense of the supernatural being connected to religious beliefs.
That's a great point. Religion's always been like a rich source of inspiration for horror.
Yeah.
It taps into those primal fears about the unknown, the afterlife,
Mm.
and the possibility of evil lurking in the shadows of our belief systems.
It makes me wonder if they're using these religious elements to, like, create a sense of sacrilege, like
Yeah.
adding another layer of terror by suggesting that even sacred ground isn't safe from those forces of darkness.
That's a fascinating interpretation.
Yeah.
It suggests Don't Knock Twice is not just about a haunted house, it's about a haunting of, like, faith itself,
Yeah. Yeah.
which is a terrifying concept.
It is, yeah. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already, from horror conventions and genre theory to audience engagement and the use of religious imagery. But I'm curious, what do you think is like the most effective technique they've used in marketing these films?
It's hard to choose just one,
Mm-hmm.
but I think the most effective technique is their ability to um, create a sense of mystery and anticipation.
Yeah.
They give you just enough information to pique your curiosity, draw you in, but they leave you wanting more, like needing to know what happens next. That's what makes these posters and trailers so successful.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just selling you a movie, they're selling you a mystery, a nightmare that you have to experience for yourself.
I completely agree. They've managed to create that perfect balance of like fear and intrigue. You want to watch even though you know it's going to scare you.
Precisely, and that's the magic of horror marketing.
Okay, so let's take a closer look at how they achieve that.
It's fascinating how both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice play with those classic horror tropes.
Yeah.
Like, they use those familiar elements, but give them a unique twist.
Totally. Like we were talking about with those demonic hands in Drag Me to Hell, and then like the skeletal hand in Don't Knock Twice. Both classic horror imagery,
Right.
but they're used in very different ways to create that specific mood.
Exactly. And that's what keeps the genre, like, fresh, It's that balance of the familiar and the unexpected. You get those, like, classic horror elements you crave, but with enough originality to keep you guessing.
It's like they're acknowledging those classic horror movies we all know and love, but
Yeah.
then saying, but wait, there's more. This one is different.
I like that. And speaking of classic elements,
Yeah.
let's revisit the use of fire in Drag Me to Hell for a moment.
Okay.
The exam mentions it's like a recurring motif appearing in both the poster and the trailer.
Oh, yeah. The fiery background on the poster, it like immediately grabs your attention.
Yeah.
And then those quick flashes of fire in the trailer, too.
Yeah.
It definitely creates a sense of danger and like hellfire,
Right. But fire can also symbolize purification, cleansing.
Oh, okay.
So it kind of adds this layer of complexity to the story, right?
Yeah.
Is Christine being punished? Or is she going through some kind of fiery trial to purge her guilt? The marketing plays with that duality.
That's a really interesting point. It makes you think about Christine's journey on like a deeper level.
Yeah.
Is it just about escaping hell or is there a chance for redemption?
And that ambiguity is what keeps us hooked.
Yeah.
We want to see how her story unfolds and what the fire ultimately represents for her.
Okay, so let's switch gears back to Don't Knock Twice.
Yeah.
And its use of religious themes.
Yeah.
We touched on it earlier, but the exam really emphasizes those Christian icons,
Yeah.
especially the Virgin Mary.
Yes. And it's not just a random visual element.
Okay.
Remember, we discussed the character Tira, who models for a Virgin Mary sculpture.
Right. Yeah.
That juxtaposition of the sacred and the profane, the pure and the potentially demonic, immediately sets like an unsettling tone.
It's like they're deliberately blurring the lines between good and evil,
Yeah.
suggesting that like even the most sacred symbols can be corrupted or twisted.
Mm-hmm.
It definitely plays into those anxieties people have about the nature of good and evil,
Yeah,
especially in a religious context.
exactly. And it also reinforces the idea that appearances can be deceiving.
Oh,
Kara may look innocent, but is she truly?
right.
That uncertainty adds a layer of psychological tension.
Now, the exam also delves into the psychological aspects of horror marketing.
Oh, yeah.
It talks about like how they use specific techniques to evoke fear and create that feeling of dread that we've been talking about.
Right. They're playing with our senses,
Yeah.
using things like lighting, color palettes, camera angles,
Mhm.
even sound design to kind of manipulate our emotions
Yeah.
and prepare us for those scare moments.
It's like they're priming our brains for fear.
Yeah.
Okay, so like give me some specific examples.
Sure.
What are they doing with these techniques? Well, think about like the use of low-key lighting in both films.
Mm-hmm.
By shrouding the characters in shadow,
Yeah.
they obscure details and create a sense of unease. It taps into that primal fear of the unknown. like what we can't see.
Oh, I get it. Like when you're walking down a dark street at night and you can't see who or what is around you,
Yeah.
your imagination just starts to run wild.
Exactly.
And like every shadow becomes a potential threat.
And horror films capitalize on that instinct.
Mm-hmm.
By limiting our vision, they force us to rely on our other senses,
Yeah.
which can be heightened and distorted in moments of fear.
So even though we're just watching a movie, our bodies are reacting as if we're actually in danger.
Precisely. And that's the brilliance of it.
Yeah.
They're creating a physiological response.
Oh, wow.
Triggering those fight or flight instincts that make the fear feel like real,
Right.
even when we know it's not.
Okay, so what about sound design?
Oh, yeah.
How are they using that to manipulate us?
Sound is like crucial in horror.
Think about those like sudden jarring sound effects.
Yeah.
Like a door slamming shut, a scream echoing in the darkness. Those are designed to like startle us, to trigger that jump scare response.
Right. But it's not just about the loud noises, is it?
No.
I noticed in the Don't Knock Twice trailer, they use a lot of creepy ambient noises, like wind howling, floorboards creaking.
You're right. Those subtle sounds are equally important. They
Yeah.
create a sense of unease, that feeling that something is lurking just out of sight. It's like they're whispering in your ear, be afraid, be very afraid.
That's so creepy. And it works. Those subtle sounds often like creep me out more than the loud jump scares because they just build that tension slowly
Right.
and make you feel like you're being watched or followed.
And that's the goal,
Yeah?
to create that pervasive sense of dread that keeps you on edge throughout the entire film.
Now, the exam also mentions the narrative structure of these films,
Okay.
particularly how they use a classic 3-act structure to build tension.
And deliver those satisfying scares.
Yes, the 3-act structure is like a tried and true storytelling formula,
Yeah.
and it works particularly well in horror.
Yeah.
You have the setup where we meet the characters, the rules of the world are established.
Yeah.
Then there's the confrontation where the horror intensifies, the characters face their fears,
Yeah.
and finally the resolution,
Right.
where we see the outcome of those confrontations.
It's like a roller coaster ride.
Yeah.
You have that slow climb to the top, building anticipation, then those twists and turns that keep you screaming.
Yeah.
And finally that, like, exhilarating but terrifying plunge.
A perfect analogy.
Yeah.
And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice follow this structure,
Okay.
carefully pacing those scare moments,
Mm.
building the tension to keep the audience engaged.
So can we, like, break that down a little more? How does that 3-act structure actually play out in these films? Sure. In Drag Me to Hell, the setup introduces us to Christine's seemingly normal life and her ambition to succeed at her job.
Yeah.
The confrontation begins with a curse
Right.
and escalates as she desperately tries to break it.
Mm-hmm.
The resolution, well, let's just say it leaves the audience with a chilling sense of inevitability.
You're right. It's not a happy ending.
No.
It reinforces that fear of the unknown and the sense that sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you can't escape your fate.
That's a classic horror trope, right?
Yeah.
It plays into those like existential anxieties we all have about death, the afterlife, and the possibility of forces beyond our control.
Now, what about Don't Knock Twice? How does that film use the 3-act structure?
In Don't Knock Twice, the setup introduces Jess and her strained relationship with her daughter, Chloe.
Okay.
It also establishes the rules of the urban legend, setting the stage for the horror to come.
Yeah.
The confrontation begins when Chloe knocks on the door, and the witch's presence becomes increasingly menacing.
Yeah.
The resolution, without giving too much away,
Yeah.
involves a final confrontation with the witch
Okay.
and a potential resolution to Jess and Chloe's relationship.
Okay, so both films follow this structure, but they also have their own unique, like, twists and turns, right?
Yes.
Drag Me to Hell focuses more on that descent into hell and that feeling of, like, impending doom, and Don't Knock Twice uses the 3-act structure to, like, build suspense around the urban legend and explore those themes of family and redemption.
Exactly. They're using the same framework,
Yeah.
but telling very different stories.
Right.
Which is why they appeal to different audiences within the horror genre.
Speaking of engaging different audiences, the exam also mentions the use of unreliable narrators in these films.
Oh, interesting.
I'm curious, how does that play into the marketing and the overall, like, horror experience?
That's a great question.
Yeah.
Unreliable narrators are a fantastic tool in horror because they create a sense of uncertainty and paranoia.
Right.
You're never quite sure what's real and what's a product of the narrator's, like, distorted perception.
Oh, I see what you mean. It's like that feeling you get when you're watching a movie.
Yeah.
And you start to question whether the protagonist is actually seeing ghosts or if they're just going crazy.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice play with this idea.
Okay.
And Drag Me to Hell, Christine's grasp on reality starts to slip as the curse intensifies.
Mm-hmm.
We see things from her perspective, but we're never entirely sure if what she's seeing is real or a hallucination.
So it makes the horror, like, more psychological,
Yeah.
more internal. We're not just scared of the monster. We're
Yeah.
scared of what's happening inside Christine's mind.
Right. And in Don't Knock Twice, the unreliability comes from the urban legend itself.
Okay.
Is the witch real?
Yeah.
Or is it just a story that's taken on a life of its own?
Yeah.
The characters and the audience are constantly questioning what's true and what's a product of their own fear and imagination.
That's clever. It keeps you guessing.
Yeah.
It makes the horror more pervasive.
Mm.
It's not just about a physical threat. It's about the power of belief
Right.
and the fear that can be generated by, like, stories and legends.
And that ambiguity, that uncertainty,
Yeah.
is what makes these films so effective.
Mm.
They leave you with more questions than answers. And that lingering sense of unease stays with you long after the movie is over.
Okay, so we've talked about, like, the use of sound and visuals to create fear.
Yeah.
We've discussed narrative structure and unreliable narrators.
Mm-hmm.
But the exam also mentions something called foreshadowing.
Right.
I'm not quite sure what that means in a horror context.
Foreshadowing is essentially like planting clues or hints about what's to come
Okay.
without explicitly revealing the danger.
Right.
It's a way to build suspense
Right.
and keep the audience guessing.
Oh, I see. Like those little moments in a horror movie. Mm-hmm.
Where you see a shadow flitting across a wall
Yeah.
or hear a strange noise in the distance.
Right.
You don't know what it means yet, but you know it's probably bad news.
Exactly. And Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice utilize foreshadowing effectively.
Okay.
Remember those early scenes in Drag Me to Hell
Yeah.
where Christine experiences those, like, strange occurrences, like the fly buzzing around her, or those unsettling encounters with Mrs. Ganoush?
Yes. I remember thinking, okay, something weird is definitely going on here.
Right,
But at that point, you don't know how bad it's going to get.
right. Those are subtle hints that something is off,
Yeah.
that the supernatural is starting to seep into her life.
Mm-hmm.
They foreshadow the horror to come without giving too much away.
And in Don't Knock Twice, the foreshadowing is more tied to the urban legend itself, right?
Exactly. The tagline, once to wake her from her bed, twice to raise her from the dead, immediately establishes those rules
Yeah.
and consequences.
And throughout the film, there are those subtle reminders of the legend.
Mm,
Characters whispering warnings,
yeah.
glimpses of the witch's presence. It's like they're constantly saying, remember the legend. Remember what happens if you knock twice.
So they're keeping that threat at the forefront of the audience's mind,
Yeah,
building that sense of anticipation and dread.
precisely. Foreshadowing is a powerful tool in horror because it allows the filmmakers to tap into our natural curiosity and fear of the unknown.
Okay, so we've talked about how they create that sense of unease and dread.
Mm-hmm.
But what about those, like, big scare moments,
Yeah.
jump scares?
Right.
The exam mentions that both films utilize them, but I'm curious, like, how effective are jump scares, really?
Jump scares are a bit controversial in the horror world.
Okay,
Some people love them.
yeah.
Others find them, like, cheap and manipulative.
I can see both sides. I mean,
Yeah.
they definitely get your heart racing,
Yeah.
but they don't always leave a lasting impression. It's like a quick jolt of adrenaline.
Right. But then it's gone.
And I think the key to using jump scares effectively is to use them sparingly
Okay.
and strategically.
Yeah.
You don't want to overuse them
Well-
because then they lose their impact.
Yeah, totally.
And you want to make sure they're earned,
Mhm.
meaning like they come after a buildup of tension and suspense.
So it's not just about randomly throwing in, like, loud noises and sudden movements. It's about creating a context for those scares,
Exactly.
making them feel like a natural progression of the story.
And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice
Mm.
seem to understand this.
Okay.
They use jump scares, but they don't rely on them entirely. they use them to punctuate those moments of heightened tension,
Yeah.
to make those scares hit harder.
Okay, so they're using a whole toolbox of techniques.
Yeah.
Sound, visuals, narrative structure, foreshadowing, even jump scares,
Right.
to craft that horror experience.
Yeah.
And what's really interesting is how they tailor those techniques to fit the specific tone and style of each film. Drag Me to Hell embraces that, like, over-the-top, grotesque horror,
Right.
while Don't Knock Twice opts for a more atmospheric, suspenseful approach.
Right. It's like they're speaking to different audiences within the horror genre, offering like different flavors of fear.
And that's what makes horror so diverse and fascinating.
Yeah.
There's something for everyone, whether you prefer your horror like gory and visceral
Right.
or psychological and unsettling.
Okay, so we've talked about the techniques they use, but I'm also curious about like the evolution of special effects in horror.
Oh, yeah.
The exam touches on like how technology has changed the way horror movies are made and how
Yeah.
that affects the scares.
That's a great point. Special effects have always been like a crucial part of horror,
Yeah.
allowing filmmakers to like bring those monsters and creatures to life.
Right.
And as technology has advanced, those effects have become increasingly realistic and terrifying.
Oh, yeah. Remember those old horror movies where the monsters were clearly just guys in rubber suits?
Yeah.
It's kind of funny to watch now.
Right. But those were scary at the time.
Yeah.
Because they were pushing the boundaries of what was possible.
Yeah.
Now, with like CGI and motion capture technology, we can create creatures that look and move in incredibly realistic ways.
So it's not just about creating like a scary looking monster anymore.
Right.
It's about making it move and interact with the environment in a way that feels believable,
Yeah,
which makes the horror like even more effective.
exactly.
Yeah.
And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice
Yeah.
utilize special effects to enhance the horror, but they do so in very different ways.
Okay.
Drag Me to Hell goes for that over-the-top, visceral style with those grotesque depictions of like demonic entities and transformation.
Hey, those scenes are definitely hard to watch. It's
Yeah.
like you're pushing the boundaries of like what's acceptable, and
Yeah.
making you squirm in your seat.
And that's the point, right?
Yeah.
To create a visceral reaction.
Yeah.
And it's effective because they're tapping into those primal fears of like bodily invasion and transformation.
And what about Don't Knock Twice? How does that film use special effects?
Don't Knock Twice takes a more subtle approach.
Okay.
The special effects are used to create atmosphere and suspense rather than like gross out moments.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
It's more about those fleeting glimpses of the witch,
Mm-hmm.
those distorted shadows and those creepy movements in the darkness.
Hmm.
They're using special effects to like suggest the presence of something sinister
Yeah,
rather than showing it outright.
exactly. And that's often more effective because it taps into our imagination.
Oh, totally.
Like our minds fill in the blanks,
Yeah.
creating an image that's far more terrifying than anything they could show on screen.
That's so true. It's like they're saying, here's a glimpse of the horror, now you imagine the rest.
Yeah.
And our imaginations are often like far more terrifying than anything Hollywood can conjure up.
And speaking of Hollywood and the film industry,
Yeah.
the exam also touches on the importance of marketing and distribution in the success of horror films.
Mm-hmm.
It's not just about making a good movie. It's about getting it seen by the right audience.
Right. We've talked a lot about like those trailers and posters.
Yeah.
But how do studios actually get those materials in front of the people who are most likely to watch these movies?
Well, in today's world, it's all about like targeting specific demographics
Okay.
and utilizing various platforms to reach those audiences.
So it's not just about like putting up a billboard or running a TV ad anymore. It's
Right.
about being more strategic.
Exactly. They're using data and analytics to identify those horror fans,
Mhm.
those people who are most likely to be interested in these movies.
Right.
And then they're using like social media, online advertising,
Yeah.
even partnerships with streaming services to get those trailers and posters in front of them.
So it's like a highly targeted campaign. They're not
Yeah.
just casting a wide net. They're aiming for those like specific pockets of horror enthusiasts who are going to be most receptive to the message.
Precisely.
Yeah.
And they're also using those platforms to like build online communities,
No, yeah.
engage with fans, and create a buzz around these movies.
Oh, yeah. I've seen those online communities.
Mhm.
They're full of passionate fans discussing theories,
Yeah.
sharing fan art,
Mm.
creating their own horror content. It's like a whole subculture built around the genre.
And that's incredibly valuable for studios.
Yeah.
These fans become like evangelists for the movies,
Right.
spreading the word organically and generating excitement that traditional advertising can't replicate.
So it's not just about selling a movie anymore. It's about building a community around it.
And that's how you create a lasting impact.
Mm.
You give the fans something to connect with,
Yeah.
something to be passionate about.
Right.
And that passion translates into box office success.
Okay, so studios are getting smarter about targeting those horror fans. But I'm also curious about how they use those platforms to actually engage those audiences,
Yeah.
to make them feel like they're a part of the experience.
Well, that's where those interactive elements come in.
Okay.
Remember how we talked about the Drag Me to Hell website where you could send like virtual curses to your friends?
Oh, yeah.
That's a great example of how they're using technology to create like an immersive experience that goes beyond just watching the trailer.
Oh, yeah. That was fun.
Mm-hmm.
It's like they're giving you a little taste of the horror,
Yeah.
a way to interact with the film's world in a playful but slightly creepy way.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also like a clever way to generate buzz and get people talking about the movie.
And what about Don't Knock Twice? Did they do anything similar?
Yes. They ran a social media challenge where fans could share their own creepy knock-knock jokes.
Oh, that's cool. It's simple, but it tacks into that spirit of playful horror and encourages fan participation.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's also a great way to tap into that word-of-mouth marketing we talked about. People share those jokes with their friends who might then become interested in the movie.
Okay, so they're using these platforms to create a more immersive and interactive experience, which makes the marketing more engaging and memorable.
Precisely. And it's also a way to stand out in a crowded entertainment landscape,
Yeah.
With so many movies and shows vying for our attention.
Right.
Studios have to find creative ways to break through the noise and make their film stand out.
Okay, let's dive a bit deeper into those creative techniques.
Okay.
The exam mentions the use of social commentary and allegory in these films.
Oh, yeah.
Suggesting that they're not just about scares, they're also about exploring deeper themes and anxieties within society.
That's an important point.
Yeah.
Horror has always been a genre that reflects societal anxieties, often using monsters and supernatural elements as metaphors for real-world issues.
So it's a safe space to confront those anxieties, to explore those dark corners of our collective consciousness without directly addressing the complexities of real world problems.
Exactly. And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice tap into this.
Okay, so give me some examples. How are they using horror to explore those deeper themes?
Well, Drag Me to Hell, while primarily a supernatural horror film, also touches on themes of economic anxiety and the consequences of greed.
Right.
Christine's decision to deny Mrs. Ganush that loan extension has devastating consequences.
Right. It makes you think about the ethics of lending practices, the desperation people feel when they're struggling financially, and the ripple effect that one seemingly small decision can have.
Exactly. It adds a layer of social commentary to the horror.
Yeah.
And in Don't Knock Twice, the film explores themes of familial trauma, addiction, and the challenges of redemption.
Right.
Jess is a recovering addict trying to repair her relationship with her daughter,
Yeah.
while also confronting this supernatural threat.
That's those anxieties we all have about family relationships, the mistakes we make, and the possibility of redemption.
Precisely. And by exploring these themes through the lens of horror, the filmmakers are adding depth and complexity to the narrative, making the characters more relatable,
Right.
and their struggles more meaningful.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, from those classic horror tropes to the use of technology and the exploration of deeper social themes. It's amazing to see how much thought and strategy goes into crafting these marketing campaigns.
It really is.
Yeah.
And it just goes to show that horror as a genre is constantly evolving and finding new ways to tap into our deepest fears and anxieties.
And speaking of evolution, I'm curious, what do you think the future of horror marketing looks like?
That's a fascinating question.
Yeah.
I think we'll see studios continuing to push the boundaries of interactivity.
Okay.
Using virtual reality,
Mm-hmm.
augmented reality,
Right.
and other emerging technologies to create even more immersive and engaging experiences.
Oh, that's so cool. I can imagine being able to step into the world of a horror movie,
Yeah.
to like experience those scares firsthand.
Right.
It would be terrifying, but also incredible.
Right. And I think we'll also see studios getting even more sophisticated with their use of like data and analytics, personalizing those marketing campaigns
Yeah.
and delivering content that's tailored to each individual's preferences and fears.
So the future of horror marketing is all about like personalization and interactivity.
I think so.
Yeah.
And it's going to be exciting to see how those trends shape the genre
Yeah.
and how some makers continue to innovate and find new ways to scare us.
Okay, before we move on, I want to touch on one more point from the exam.
Okay.
It mentions the use of humor in horror, which seems counterintuitive,
Yeah,
but it actually makes sense when you think about it.
absolutely. Humor in horror can be tricky. But when done well, it can be incredibly effective. It can provide a release from the tension,
Yep.
create a sense of unease by juxtaposing the horrific with the absurd,
Right.
and even enhance the impact of scares by, like, catching the audience off guard.
Oh, like those moments in a horror movie where a character cracks a joke at the worst possible time.
Yeah.
It makes you laugh, but it also makes you feel kind of uncomfortable because you know something terrible is about to happen.
Exactly. And Drag Me to Hell, in particular, incorporates those moments of, like, dark humor.
Yeah, like that scene where Christine tries to bake a cake to appease Mrs. Ganush,
Yeah.
and it all goes hilariously wrong.
It does, yeah.
It's funny, but it also adds to that sense of impending doom.
Right. And it's also a way to make the characters more relatable.
Huh.
Even in the midst of this, like, terrifying situation.
Yeah.
They're still human. They still have those moments of, like, awkwardness and humor.
And what about Don't Knock Twice? Does that film use humor at all?
It's less overt, but there are those subtle moments of humor in the interactions between Jess and her daughter, Chloe.
Yeah.
It's not laugh-out-loud funny, but it adds a layer of warmth and humanity to their relationship.
So it's like a reminder that even in the darkest of times,
Yeah,
there's still room for connection and even a little bit of laughter.
exactly. And those moments of humor can make the horror all the more impactful because they highlight the contrast between the mundane and the terrifying.
Yeah, I think we've covered a lot of ground here.
Yeah.
We've talked about the techniques they use to create fear, the psychology of horror marketing, and the like evolving landscape of the genre.
We've certainly explored a lot,
Yeah.
and it's been fascinating to see how Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice utilize those techniques in unique ways to create, like, two very different but equally terrifying horror experiences.
Okay, let's move on to the final part of this deep dive where we'll like wrap up our analysis
Okay.
and explore those lingering questions that these films leave us with.
You know, it's interesting how both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice tap into those classic horror tropes of curses and hauntings,
Right.
but they also go beyond the surface level to
Yeah.
explore deeper themes.
It's not just about those jump scares and creepy visuals.
It's not just about those jump scares and creepy visuals.
Right.
They delve into those, like, darker aspects of human nature, guilt, desperation, the struggle for redemption.
It's like they're saying, hey, there are real consequences to our actions, and sometimes those consequences can be terrifying.
Exactly. And that connection between the protagonist's choices
Yeah.
and the horrors they face is crucial.
It's not just like random bad luck.
No.
It feels like earned, which makes it even scarier.
Precisely. It adds a layer of psychological complexity to the horror.
So in Drag Me to Hell, Christine's decision to deny Mrs. Ganush that loan extension
Right.
sets this whole chain of events in motion.
And it's not just about ambition.
Right.
It's about survival, right?
Yeah.
She's trying to secure her own position at the bank. But that decision comes back to haunt her in a very literal way.
It's like a morality tale with like a supernatural twist.
Exactly. And the film explores, like, the psychological toll of that guilt,
Right.
her desperation to break the curse,
Yeah.
and ultimately her inability to escape the consequences of her actions.
And in Don't Knock Twice, Jess's past as an addict and her strained relationship with her daughter
Right.
create this vulnerability that the supernatural entity exploits.
Right. She's carrying the weight of her past mistakes,
Yeah.
and that guilt makes her an easy target.
It's like horror is both external with the witch and internal with those demons she's battling within herself.
It's a fascinating dynamic.
Yeah.
And it adds a layer of realism to the horror.
Now, The Exam also talks about the use of suspense in these films
Oh, yeah?
and how they create that feeling of anticipation that keeps us on the edge of our seats.
Suspense is crucial in horror.
Absolutely. It's that slow burn, that feeling that something terrible is about to happen.
And these films are masters of suspense.
Yeah.
They use silence.
Mm-hmm.
Sudden noises, shadowy figures, flickering lights.
Right.
All those classic techniques.
It's like they're playing with our nerves, making us like hyper aware of every little detail.
And that heightened awareness makes those jump scares, when they do come,
yeah.
so much more effective.
Right. Because we're already primed for fear.
Exactly. They're manipulating our expectations, keeping us off balance,
Yeah.
and then delivering those moments of pure terror.
Now, before we wrap up, I want to touch on something we haven't discussed yet.
Okay.
The endings of these films.
Ah, yes.
Yeah.
The endings are crucial in horror.
Because they can either leave you feeling satisfied or completely unsettled.
Right. And both Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice have endings that spark a lot of discussion and debate.
Okay, so let's start with Drag Me to Hell. I have to admit, that ending was brutal. I was not expecting that.
It's definitely not your typical happy ending.
No, it's bleak, it's unexpected,
Yeah.
and it leaves you with this, like, lingering sense of dread.
And I think that's what makes it so effective.
Right. It reinforces that sense of hopelessness. That, like, sometimes, no matter how hard you fight, you can't escape your fate.
It's a classic horror trope, but it's done so well in this film.
Now, what about Don't Knock Twice? That ending is a bit more ambiguous, isn't it?
Yes. It leaves more room for interpretation.
It's not a clear-cut victory,
Right.
but there's a sense of hope, a possibility of redemption.
And I think that's what makes it so interesting.
It makes you think about the nature of good and evil, the power of belief,
Yeah.
and the possibility of, like, breaking free from those cycles of trauma and abuse.
It's a powerful message, and it's delivered in a way that's both terrifying and thought-provoking.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We've explored those terrifying trailers and posters, dissected the techniques that make these films so effective, and even delved into, like, the psychology of fear itself.
It's been a fascinating journey,
It has.
and I think we've proven that horror, when done well, is more than just, like, cheap thrills and jump scares.
Right. It's a genre that can explore, like, profound themes, challenge our perceptions,
Yeah.
and even offer glimpses of hope amidst the darkness.
I think that's what makes it so enduring and captivating.
Okay, so before we wrap up, I want to circle back to that John Carpenter quote we mentioned at the beginning.
Oh, yeah.
He said, "Horror is a universal language." Do you think these films and their marketing campaigns confirm that?
Absolutely. They tap into those, like, primal fears we all share.
Mm-hmm.
The fear of the unknown, the fear of death, the fear of losing control.
And they do it in a way that's both specific to the individual film,
Yeah.
but, like, universal in its appeal.
Right. They use those classic horror conventions, but also find, like, unique ways to twist and subvert them.
Yeah.
Offering something familiar and something new.
And that's the key to successful horror.
Right.
Finding that balance between giving the audience what they expect and surprising them with something unexpected.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It's about playing with those expectations, keeping the audience guessing, and delivering those moments of pure terror that stay with you long after the movie is over.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into the marketing of Drag Me to Hell and Don't Knock Twice.
It's been a pleasure exploring these films with you.
Likewise, and I hope our listeners have enjoyed this journey into the dark side of cinema.
Remember, keep those lights on
Yes.
and maybe double check that you locked the door.
Yeah.
Just in case.
Until our next deep dive, stay curious and remember, sometimes the most terrifying stories are the ones that reflect our own deepest fears.